Hello folks, we're down the line once again from Boston tonight with political author, analyst and historian Dr. James D. Boys. I'm Michael L. Roberts. This is the American Chronicle. It's Monday, May the 4th be with you, 2020, and with thanks as ever for your support for this series, we continue tonight to ride the waves of air on YouTube, Spotify, Anchor FM, and across the digital podsphere. Tonight, we find ourselves analysing another tumultuous week in American politics, with stories surrounding anti-lockdown protests, armed hold-ups of state buildings, accusations of sexual assault on the part of Joe Biden, and the role, if any, of Hillary Clinton in this year's presidential race, all once again under the good doctor's political microscope. I began, as ever then, by asking about the situation on the ground in Boston. Marty Walsh, the mayor of Boston, says that the figures are not plateauing but rather climbing, and I see from your social media output that there are orders to wear masks in place or coming into place. What's the situation on the ground in Boston, and do you see yourself being shoulder to shoulder with anyone at a Red Sox game anytime soon?
Well, as you said, the mayor has introduced, as of Tuesday, I believe it is, an order which basically says if you are going out and you can't maintain social distancing, then you are going to be required to wear a mask. This follows on from an order which was introduced 2 weeks ago now, I believe, in neighbouring Somerville, which also said that anybody going out had to wear a mask. So there was a degree to which this was anticipated. There was some feeling that perhaps the mayor might have started to ease your ability to go out and about and to start opening up premises in conjunction with an order to wear a mask, i.e. to give and take at the same time, to say, yes, we're going to start opening things up very slightly, but we're going to ask you to wear a mask going out. Clearly that hasn't quite happened yet. There is, I think, a growing sense across the nation that the country is reaching a point where people have been locked down and in place now for getting on for 2 months. And there appears to be a growing sense of resentment against both federal and state governments, as well as a growing desire, I think, by individuals who to date have been obeying the law and staying in place effectively, to think, you know what, this is getting ridiculous. The weather's getting nice here. We're now in the first week of May. I'm sitting here in Boston. It's a beautiful summer's day here. And people are starting, I think, to head back outdoors. The children have been off for a long time. We are, I think, reaching a point where the law is, the requirements to stay in place are going to start being ignored, I think, on a growing basis. This isn't helped, of course, by the president and some of the things that he's been saying. But we will be fascinated to see what starts to happen as we start to see states, particularly in the south and in the central areas of the country, begin to reopen. The extent to which there will be growing pressure upon those states, such as Massachusetts, for example, who are trying to hold the line and keep people contained within their own residences.
You mentioned that which Trump has been saying they're not necessarily helping the deal. As I understand it, no state has actually met the 2-week decline in cases prerequisite in order to bring about easing. Yet that is what the federal guidelines state. So to what extent are those federal guidelines just being ignored by individual states, and to what extent are they being poorly communicated and or hidden by the federal government?
Well, yeah, as you said, the idea is that what is required is a 2-week downturn in these figures, and that hasn't happened anywhere as far as I'm aware. We're starting to see perhaps signs that this might be slowing down, but certainly not going into any sense of remission. The challenge you've got, though, is that just last night, for example, the president said, "Oh, things are going to be fine," and he certainly seems to be throwing his lot in with those armed protesters in places like Michigan, who have been bringing state governments into severe chaos, quite frankly. The sight of armed militia members standing in state houses with semi-automatic weapons is quite a sight, I can assure you. And when they appear to have the support of the president, that really puts what might be thought as undue pressure, I think, upon state governments across the country. So the challenge is, I think, that there is a growing sense amongst a growing number of people here that when you consider the mortality rates on a state-by-state basis, and when you consider, say, here, for example, in Massachusetts, 50% of the mortality rate is within care homes. And then if you start to look at how the groupings break down of the other 50%, I think many people are arriving at the conclusion that the actual mortality rate is relatively low. And quote unquote, what's all the fuss about? I'm not in a care home. I'm not in a high risk population. If I go out, I'll be careful, blah, 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 blah. And so you're starting to see a breakdown in the requirements to stay at home, I think. And the challenge you're going to have, I think, is what happens when people start to enforce that. We've seen, for example, park rangers in the last 24 hours being assaulted and pushed into ponds. We're starting to see pushback against individuals who try to enforce social distancing. So the challenge, I think, is as Americans attempt to defy regulations and move back into open spaces, there is going to be, I think, increasing conflict, not only between state and federal forces, but amongst individuals themselves, as they start to almost enforce social distancing. People will or will not be wearing masks. How will people who are wearing masks react to people who aren't wearing masks in this era? So the risk, I think, of a breakdown in what might be thought of as law and order and civil society appears to be increasing at this point.
That breakdown that you described there, and also you touched upon the Michigan situation. I've been desperate to ask you in terms of Governor Gretchen Whitmer, who you've mentioned as a potential Biden vice president candidate down the line. Those incredible images of what appeared in sort of headline terms as an armed storming of a state building. Could you give us your analysis of the narrative, please?
So one of the fascinating things about the United States is the degree to which the states are anything but united. There are a great many divergences with regard to laws from state to state. And one of the bizarre things that many people might find is that apparently it's quite legal to carry a weapon into the state house in Michigan as long as you don't have, quote, ill intent, which I thought quite bizarre, quite frankly. So those images of people carrying semi-automatic weapons into the state house in Michigan are acting quite within the law, as long as they say, that's all right, I have no ill intent towards the governor. Why you would carry an automatic weapon if you have no ill intent is frankly beyond me. But it's important to stress that they are not, quote unquote, breaking any laws in what they're doing. They may look intimidating. They might scare the bejeebers out of likes of you and I, quite frankly. And from an external point of view, both as someone sitting here in Massachusetts and to anybody sitting outside the United States, they might look at this and think, well, this is just a breakdown of law and order. What on earth is going on? Under Michigan law, by all accounts, they are abiding by the law. I should point out, however, that I just finished watching Waco, which is an interesting miniseries on Netflix about the Branch Davidian sects, which some might remember ended in a fiery climax in the spring of 1993. And it was pointed out then that even though many of the actions of David Koresh and his members were seen to be abhorrent by the United States, under Texan law, many of his actions were actually quite legal. So that gives you some indication about how extreme some state law can be here in the United States. Within Michigan itself, very clearly, the governor has come under great pressure. But what's also being revealed, I think, is some of the very bizarre and troubling, and one would hope only ignorant, if not necessarily evil mindset of some of the individuals who are out protesting. And what I mean by that is there are signs which have been in the protests, which have been written in German, and the signage which has been held up, which makes reference to the idea that, you know, hard work is good for the soul, etc., etc., is the exact wording which was engraved on the gates of Auschwitz. You know, you cannot make this stuff up, quite frankly. All at the same time that they are portraying the governor as a Nazi. Again, the dynamics of this, the visuals of this are quite astonishing. But so too, I think the utter levels of ignorance by those people who are on the streets.
Moving now to the Trump briefings. Obviously, last week we found ourselves in the midst of Breachgate and otherwise. This time round, the headlines seem to suggest that Trump was no longer going to do them, and then they were back on. And then I think I saw shortly before we came on today that CNN and other channels were no longer going to broadcast the briefings were Trump to return, or indeed had he already done so. Your analysis thereof, please.
Yeah, so there's a real roller coaster situation here with regard to the president and his press briefings. As we've discussed before, there is, I believe, a sense that one of the main reasons he's engaging in them is this attempt to continue his compact with his core group of supporters. He can't go out into the country to have large 25,000 seat arena rallies. So he has cottoned onto the idea of having a daily press briefing, some of which are related up to 90 minutes. He believes, I think, that you know, the more he talks, the more he can convey his strength to his leaders effectively. Of course, I think what's happened is there's been a growing realization amongst some at the White House and certainly amongst the Republican Party that, quite frankly, the more Donald Trump talks, the more trouble he gets into. We saw last week, as you suggested there, pushback against what he suggested about how one could start using disinfectant, issues about getting light inside people's bodies. I mean, this is almost, you know, bizarre world, quite frankly. What we've seen this week is an attempt, I think, by the White House to try to get a grasp upon the situation. The new press secretary has made her first appearance at the podium in the press briefing room, interestingly stating quite categorically that she will not lie to the journalists in the room. It's quite something, I think, when a press secretary has to make her debut by saying that she'll be honest with the press. Either you take from that what you will, either implicit or explicit in that statement is the recognition that perhaps her predecessors have been less than honest, or perhaps, shall we say, other people speaking at that podium have been less than honest. Draw from that what you will. So that's been an interesting development. Also, the White House has prevented Dr. Fauci from testifying before a committee led by the House of Representatives in coming days as being not worth his time, but has allowed him to testify before a Senate committee. In case anybody thinks, well, what's the difference? I would remind everybody that the House of Representatives is controlled by the Democrats, and therefore that committee would be chaired by Democrats, and the Senate is currently controlled by the Republicans, and therefore that committee would be chaired by Republicans in the majority. So you would clearly have a very, very different reception for Dr. Fauci were he to appear before the Senate committee as opposed to the House committee. So you are starting to see this roller coaster approach. The media have long debated whether they should continue to broadcast Donald Trump's appearances, because as we discussed last week, there was a sense that 4 years ago, Donald Trump was very astute in making use of free airtime by phoning in and appearing at will, it would appear, on several television shows. This time round, it appears that that free media time has been gotten by using the White House podium to deliver a nightly TV address to his supporters and, by extension, all Americans. And this, of course, is particularly disadvantageous to the likes of Joe Biden, who is struggling to get airtime. And I think that the networks have finally cottoned on to the idea that this really is going beyond merely passing information on to Americans for their own well-being, and has probably moved into the realm of what we would think of in the UK as a party political broadcast.
Mm. I saw Chuck Schumer suggest that he'd love to get Fauci into that situation without Donald Trump hanging over his shoulder, as it were. Do you think Fauci would feel free to talk in that sense, or would Donald Trump always be overshadowing him and influencing whatever communications he would impart?
Well, I think it's interesting with regard to Anthony Fauci in terms of what he has said. He has, I think, on many occasions been quite candid, certainly more so than many people who work in this administration. This, of course, has led to great questions about how long he can possibly survive in his job for. He's, I think, made references to himself. The president has addressed this, suggesting he has no intention of firing him. For those of you who caught the Saturday Night Live sketch last week with Brad Pitt playing the good doctor, he himself alluded at the top of that that of course he thinks he's going to get fired. It would, I think, be a remarkable situation for Donald Trump to fire this individual, who has, of course, I think, captured the public imagination with regard to his statements and appearances. It's not every day that some otherwise anonymous individual working with the federal government gets played by Brad Pitt. That's an extent to which I think he has entered the public consciousness. Of course, I say it would be quite remarkable for Donald Trump to do something. I'm sure many of your listeners are screaming at this broadcast going, of course it's incredible. He does the incredible all the time and gets away with it. And they'd be quite right. I think that he will stay in his post. Hey, it's only 6 months until the presidential election. He might well be in his position longer than Donald Trump.
Indeed, 6 months, and leading me nicely on, as you always do, with a perfect segue into my thoughts, my questions rather, on regarding the campaign situation. And of course, it feels necessary first to turn to Joe Biden and the Tara Reid scenario, and to ask, within the context of Mika Brzezinski's interview and otherwise your analysis on the extent to which this moment for Biden causes irreparable damage, or the extent to which, in the age of Trump, it's completely survivable.
You know, it's kind of difficult to know where to begin with this. You know, we live in an era of Me Too, and the Democratic Party in particular has been adamant that all women who make a claim deserve to be heard, potentially believed, in some cases almost on face value. That is a lot easier to adhere to when those claims are being made against Republican politicians, to people like Harvey Weinstein, i.e. not to themselves. And now we face a very difficult situation where the presumptive Democratic candidate himself is being accused of, I think, what would be accurately defined as sexual assault. Now, what do we know about this situation? It was alleged to have taken place in the early 1990s. That obviously is a long, long time ago. There is obviously a lot has taken place between now and then. Joe Biden has been the vice president of the United States for 8 of those years. To become vice president, it requires FBI vetting, political vetting, everybody involved in that process, including people like David Axelrod, for example, as well as senior members of the Biden team who were involved in the 2008 process, have said categorically, you know what, we looked for stuff like this. There was no evidence of it. If there had been, Barack Obama would never have chosen it. just taking the politics out of this, you know, if you know anything about Barack Obama, I think you'd probably have to agree with that. This isn't someone who I think would have accepted that kind of what Donald Trump would call locker room behavior for someone who was going to be his vice president. There is no evidence, I think, to suggest that that would have been tolerated by Obama, certainly not by his wife or anybody on the vetting team. So the question is was this known about at the time, or was it not? If you accept that it wasn't, then where is this now coming from? The woman at the heart of this, Tara Reid, had originally suggested, I believe, that she'd made a report of sexual assault to the correct authorities. The vice president has said, well, look, you know, if you've made a complaint, that complaint has to be somewhere within the archives. I'm happy for the National Archive to release any of my office reports, documentation, so that if it is there, we can find it, we can get to the bottom of this, et cetera, et cetera. He's denied categorically that this occurred, quite emphatically. There doesn't appear to be any wriggle room, I don't believe, in his statement. He's not relying, for example, as Bill Clinton did, upon a very narrow definition of sexual relations. If you remember when Bill Clinton famously denied his relationship with Monica Lewinsky, he didn't suggest that he hadn't had an affair with her, that he hadn't engaged in activity of X, Y, and Z. Bill Clinton had been presented with a very narrowly defined definition of sexual relations by special prosecutor, and that was why he could deny so emphatically that situation. Now, Joe Biden, to his credit, is not hiding behind some sort of obtuse legal language. He has actually denied it emphatically. So that's what that means, therefore, is if it were to emerge that there was sort of proof of this, or it could be demonstrated that this incident had occurred, Joe Biden is a very precarious position, having denied it so emphatically. He would be caught in the most blatant of lies. And as American politics has demonstrated many, many times, you can survive an incident as long as you admit it and apologize for it. What Americans won't necessarily forgive is an outright lie. And that, I think, is a lesson which, if Joe Biden hasn't learned it after more than 3 decades in public life, then quite frankly, he has no right running for the presidency. He also faces a threat beyond the moral issue and the Me Too movement issue. He faces threats, I think, with regard to this, both from the left and the right. He faces a threat from the left, from those supporters of Bernie Sanders, who never wanted him to be candidate in the first place, who believed that their candidate, Bernie Sanders, should and could indeed have become the nominee had the rest of the apparatus not conspired against him. So the far left are sort of pushing this narrative that Tara Reid should be believed and listened to, et cetera, because they have their own vested interests in this. And then, of course, the Republicans who are gearing up to run against Biden in the autumn election are looking at this and think, well, this is great. It completely removes the opportunity now for any Democrat to come after our candidate on similar grounds, because we can just turn around and say, you ready? You want to open up this can of worms? So one of the weak points of Donald Trump's political candidacy all along has been his rather problematic relationship with women and what many would see as his predatory approach. Now, if that can be taken off the table, and don't forget, the extent to which that was ever successful in terms of an approach by the Democrats has to be doubted when you consider how many millions of American women voted for Donald Trump.
Yes.
But if you can at least remove that from the table going into November because of the obvious fear of pushback from Trump against Biden, then that does, I think, make the White House's attempts to get reelected just a little easier.
I can't resist the opportunity to pick up on the Clinton element here, seeing as I have, as ever, one of the leading experts on the Clintons on the line, as it were. I think I also noticed in the Hill, just before we came on, mention that Hillary Clinton might be waiting in the wings as Biden's woman VP pick to pick up the pieces should he crumble in the mix. Your thoughts on that, and your thoughts on what the Clintons are doing or not doing in general in terms of supporting this Democrat campaign?
Hillary Clinton is sort of out there, as she has been, I think, for a while, as a sort of roving individual. Clearly at this point, Joe Biden is the presumptive Democratic Party nominee for president. How that is going to quite play out logistically over the coming weeks and months is difficult to say. We have seen primaries which are meant to be held being cancelled outright by state legislatures on the simple basis that, well, there's no point holding them because there's only one person left in this now. It's Joe Biden. Therefore, why are we going to spend money and time and energy and risk public health by having a primary in our state when all these people can do is vote for Joe Biden anyway? So on that basis, his candidacy appears assured. Now, if it were to crumble, as you suggest, if under, let's say, for example, some evidence emerged of Tara Reid's claim that would force the vice president to withdraw from the nomination, then we'd be in a really bizarre environment. In any other year, you'd think, well, okay, fair enough. There will be a convention. And if there isn't a nominee at that point, then there will be a series of ballots and the delegates there will have an opportunity to select a candidate, even though they've not gone through necessarily the primary season. That was quite normal activity many decades ago. And under those circumstances, you could say, well, presumably Hillary Clinton would throw her hat in the ring and say, well, remember me? I won the popular vote 4 years ago. I only lost the electoral college by 70,000 so votes across 3 states. I don't know. I mean, who knows, quite frankly. At this point, there doesn't appear to be much doubt that Biden will be the nominee. The allegations against him appear to have what might be thought of as a rather fluid process to them. Certain people suggesting that Miss Reid is suggesting one thing and then suggesting something else. So I think if we accept that Biden will be the nominee, the question next to be asked about Hillary is, would she be the vice presidential candidate? If you ask the question, who is the most qualified person to be vice president in the United States, it's a pretty short list, I think, and you'd have to put her on it, along with someone like John Kerry. Now, Biden has said he's going to choose a woman to be vice president. Hillary Clinton has come out in recent days and emphatically endorsed him for the presidency, in full knowledge of the allegations against him, I should point out. No senior female Democrat has so far come out and renounced his candidacy. It has been accepted by all the leading women in the Democratic Party, including both Hillary and Nancy Pelosi. I think, if anything, though, with regards to the vice presidency, one of the unspoken ideas here is that Biden will only serve one term. He's 77, if I'm not mistaken. Go figure what he would be there for if he were to win and be old enough to run for re-election. That would be, 81? Is 81 too old to be president? Well, possibly. Is 77 too old to be president? Well, possibly. Hillary Clinton isn't much younger herself, I should point out. There comes a point where you have to have a viable continuity of government. Presidents die in office. If you look back through the history of this country, not just at the hands of an assassin, but health and age play a heavy toll upon any American president. If you look at all presidents, if you see how they age in office, even JFK, who of course was America's youngest elected president. If you look at him in 1960 when he wins the election, and shortly before he's killed, just 1,000 days later on, he has aged notably. George W. Bush, the same, a rather sprightly, remarkably young-looking president in retrospect when he is elected in 2000, and 8 years on, he has aged considerably. So if you factor that aging process into someone who is at 77 or would already therefore be America's oldest elected president, do you want to be putting alongside him as the safety net, if you will, a woman who many Republicans believe had health issues of her own in 2016, and who isn't much younger than the current Vice President Joe Biden, than Vice President Biden himself. So that might well discount that. You've got to ask whether she would want it. There was a perception that she wouldn't have accepted the vice presidency in the past because, and this is the joke, she's already done that because she was effective vice president when her husband was president. There was a joke going around when Vice President Gore was in office, and the joke went, Vice President Gore was asked, how do you enjoy the vice presidency? And Gore's response is, well, she seems to like it. So that gives you some idea perhaps about the nature of power in the Clinton presidency.
Until next Monday then, this has been the American Chronicle. I'm Michael L. Roberts. Follow Dr. James D. Boyes on the links below. Music, once again, as always, by the great Chris Warner. Tune in Thursday for the Voicing the World Late Night Noisecast episode 11. Good luck, and ever onward to you all.